Hello, everybody joining. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Welcome to the webinar today. So happy you could join.
It looks like it might already be recording. I guess that happens automatically when I push broadcast. So we are live and being recorded.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. We'll get started in just a few minutes. People are still coming on. Please enter your name and where you're from and your organization into the chat so that we can start seeing where everybody is coming from. Welcome to the webinar. We have Colorado Alliance. We've got Arlington, Virginia. Welcome, everybody. Connecticut, North Carolina. Nice to see everybody. We'll still let people join. We'll be starting in just a few minutes. Galveston Bay Foundation, welcome. We have Mayo, so many great people joining. Thanks for coming. We'll start in just a few minutes. We have a great webinar in store for all of you. Hi, Amy from Peer. Nice to see you virtually. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Pennsylvania, Maine, a lot from North Carolina. Glad to have everybody here. We'll get started in another minute. We've got people from all over the world. That is so exciting. Welcome, everybody. We still have people joining us. We'll get started in 15 seconds. So get a drink and make yourself comfortable. So hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Judy Browse and I'm the Executive Director of the North American Association for Environmental Education. And we are really excited to have you here today because we do have a fantastic webinar for all of you, all about nature connection. And as many of you know, we have a new guide out to help you assess your connection to nature. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we have a wonderful panel. And in the chat, as I'm doing the intro, for those of you who come often, tell us about your last great nature experience that you've had in the chat. So we just see some of the experiences that you've had. Be great to hear what you've done in the past, 6 months. What's been the best? And I just want to say that we all know there are a lot of benefits to spending time in nature. And we know that many of you have asked questions about how do you measure nature connectiveness? How do you know if your programs are working? And this tool is going to help you. These 11 tools are going to help you because this guide, the Practitioner Guide to Assessing Connection to Nature, is what we're going to talk about today. We've got 3 amazing presenters that will be talking about the 11 tools that you can use for assessing this connection. You can also download the PDF. You'll be getting a copy of all these slides. You don't have to write down anything to be able to get a copy of this. You can also buy hard copies if you want to, if you need that, and that would be more helpful. And as I mentioned, we have a wonderful panel with Martha Monroe, Louise Chawla, and Gabby Salazar, and I'll introduce them in just a moment after I go through some introductory housekeeping. For those of you who have joined us on a number of our webinars this year, and I think we're hitting that we've done almost 20 or more webinars this year, bringing new insights to the field. We're trying to bring new speakers, new thinking, new ways of doing the work that we're all trying to do. And we'd love your ideas for webinars that you'd like to see us present that will help us move the field forward. And as always, I really want to thank our affiliate co-hosts for all their support. We have affiliates across North America who are doing the work we do at the national and international level, at the state and provincial level. So I encourage you to get involved in your state and provincial affiliate. And please remember, you can always communicate with us even though you are muted by sending us a note in the chat. You can either send it to all the panelists or you can send it to everyone. And just click the little button there, and we want to hear from you. We'd love to hear any questions you have. If you have other resources you want to put in the chat, that would be great. You will get a copy of the chat, you'll get a copy of the recording, and you will get a copy of the slides. So it will all be posted also on EE Pro afterward. And I also wanted to thank our captioner, Sabrina. We're doing live captioning today for anyone who needs help with the audio, and you will be able to see those captions if you need them. I also want to thank Ann and Drew for helping to provide support during the webinar, as always. Ann is our guru of webinar planning, and Drew is our Director of Operations. Ann is also, of course, the Director of Professional Development and the Manager of EE360 at NAAEE. And this is Drew's wedding picture, which I really like. So now is the best part. I get to turn this over to our 3 guests, and I want to just quickly introduce them. First, there's Martha Monroe. Martha is a professor, an extension specialist, and associate director of the School of Forest Resources and Conservation at the University of Florida. She has been a leader in the field of environmental education for more than 3 decades, and she focuses on curriculum development, evaluation, and conservation behavior. She is such an amazing thinker and idea generator, and I've been so lucky to work with her over the years. I think it was since we traveled together to Tonga, Fiji, and Western Samoa when we were both working with Peace Corps many years ago. And then we have Louise Chawla, who is another leader in the field of nature education and conservation education. She is a professor emerita in the environmental design program at the University of Colorado in Boulder. She's also a fellow in the university's community engagement, design, and research center. And she's also a member of the scientific advisory committee for the Children in Nature Network. She has been one of the leading writers and researchers on children and nature, children in cities, and the development of active care for the environment. And she's a founding member of Growing Up Boulder program, which is an alliance of organizations that are providing opportunities for place-based learning and giving children and youth a voice in city planning processes. And I encourage you to read everything she's written, as well as everything Martha has written. And now, last but not least, we have Gabby. And Gabby is a PhD student at the University of Florida and is the lead writer of the Practitioner Guide to Assessing Connection in Nature, which we will hear about more in a minute. She also recently helped to design and evaluate an environmental ed program in India. And she's also a conservation photojournalist and one of those wonderful National Geographic explorers. So welcome, Gabby. And now I am going to turn it over to Martha to get us started. Welcome, everybody.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Judy. Thank you all for joining us today. And it is a pleasure for us to be here and to be part of this program. I also see that in our audience today is Chris Parsons, who was another member of the team and integral in the design of this material. So this particular slide has 5 logos across the bottom. And I want to say that this whole program comes to you not from the 3 of us, but from these 5 organizations that together created this project. And in the next slide, we list, thank you. Gabby is our slide mover person today, so I'll be telling Gabby when to click the slides. So these 5 organizations led the project and worked together on a 2-year activity to create this booklet. So this team involved 2 universities, University of Florida and Stanford, and of course that meant a team of graduate students from each of these 2 universities, but also 2 organizations, the Children in Nature Network and the North American Association for Environmental Education. And those 2 organizations brought to this whole effort all of you, practitioners and workers in the field who care about assessing connection to nature. Not only the practitioners, but the infrastructure that the organizations bring, so that we could use the conferences as a part of this activity. And NAAEE was responsible for the editing and design and production of the booklet that looks so beautiful and is great. Pisces Foundation, with the last of the 5 co-leaders of the organization, funded the whole activity. So we need to thank Pisces too. So the people on the list right now on your screen are all the folks who are involved in writing, editing, revising, rereading, rewriting, re-editing the booklet that you have or that you will get. And the next slide lists the rest of the folks who were involved in the workshop that we'll be describing and the teams of groups that went out to improve the tools that we're working with. So today, what we're going to do is talk briefly about what we're thinking we're calling a connection to nature and what we've learned about assessing connection to nature. Louise will dig a little bit deeper into early childhood assessments. We'll give you an introduction to the guidebook and some scenarios so that you can see how to use it. We think we'll be ending with a good 15 minutes at the end for questions. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat. And if we can answer them immediately, we will. Otherwise, we'll talk about them at the end. So I am going to put in the chat the URL for the booklet. And so if you want to download it right now, you can add your notes to the PDF as we talk about all this stuff. So that works too. Or you can just do it later. So what are we talking about when we say connection to nature? There are lots of definitions out there. We picked this one. So this is the one we're going to talk about. The study of connectedness to nature is primarily concerned with understanding how people identify themselves with the natural environment and the relationships they form with nature. So what do we mean by nature? We're talking about ecosystems like forests, grasslands, seashores, but also we're talking about the things in nature that might be removed from that ecosystem. A tree, a flower, a bird flying overhead. So that way, nature exists in cities as well as the wilderness. So that, first of all, is what we're talking about. And secondly, when we talk about the relationship we have with nature, we mean that affective component of all those attitudes that are related to our emotional relationship with the natural environment. Any of these words count. These words are often the constructs that show up in the tools that we selected for this guidebook. So desire to be in nature, concern about the environment, feeling a sense of oneness with the natural world. They're kind of nebulous, they're difficult to pin down, and that's why having somebody else do this work is really, really helpful to environmental education practitioners. So, why do we care about measuring connection to nature? There's all sorts of research out there that correlates connection to nature to stewardship and pro-environmental actions and behaviors. Now, of course, this isn't the only thing that helps support environmental actions, but it is one thing that appears to be correlated to and maybe even predictive of actions. Where does it come from? There's some research that suggests connection to nature arises out of the values and concerns and the abilities we have for critically thinking about our environment. And all those things come from experiences that we have in nature, perhaps educational programs that we have experienced in nature. The quality of those experiences, of course, varies. It may depend on how often we go, how many times we go, how long we go, whether or not there's a mentor with us, what kind of environment we're in. And so whatever it is leading us to these components, these variables. Now, unfortunately, you can also find in the literature, not just those variables. I mean, a whole bunch of variables lead to action. But in the next slide, you can also find that connection to nature may be arising directly out of these experiences in nature and educational programs and leads to the values, concerns, and creative thinking about environment, which then leads to action. You can also imagine that the people who come to these experiences with a stronger connection to nature get different things out of those experiences. So if it comes from family or culture or the environment that you grow up in, and then you have more experiences in education, things might be a little bit different. There's so much variation out there in the people who are part of our programs, in the environments that we are in the programs themselves, in the experiences we've had, that we're not going to tell you which one of these slides is true. In fact, I think there are times when all of them are true. And maybe that sort of doesn't matter. What matters is that all of these variables are a part of the picture, and for different people, for different issues, for different times, it may be sorted in one way or another. So why do we care about measuring connection to nature? Well, we think that it matters, and if we could measure it, it could help us. It could help us improve our programs. It could help us attract more funding. It could help us market our programs to different audiences. It could help us do more research in what we're doing in environmental education. So the key now is to figure out how to assess connection to nature. And as we launched this project, we realized there's really two different kinds of ways people could use an assessment to connection to nature. One is what we've been talking about in terms of evaluation, to know if your programs are changing people's connection to nature. To do that means you're either tracking observations over time or collecting a pre and a post measure, measuring some difference between before and after, or looking backward at a program, something that you can use to evaluate a program. But that's not the only thing going on out there. For example, if I am in charge of placing parks in an urban area, I could do an assessment of the population of my urban community and realize that if people live less than a quarter mile from a park, they have a stronger connection to nature than if they live 2 miles from a park. That gives me justification to put more parks in my community. And so we can think about it in terms of planning. When you're assessing a whole population one time, and then looking at subdivisions or how some people are different than others, does it vary by ethnicity? Does it vary by geography? What accounts for differences we see in a population when we know their connection to nature? So that particular question of 2 ways to think about it will come up later in our decision tree. In the meantime, people have been thinking about connection to nature for a very long time. And psychologists in particular have developed at least 30 different tools to measure connection to nature. As creative as they are about looking at, if you could go backwards just a little bit, as creative as these people are in developing these tools, they're not so creative when it comes to naming them, because many of these names sound very, very similar. And it's not very helpful for practitioners because who knows if they got the name exactly right. So this is what we started with when we launched this project, to figure out how to help practitioners assess connection to nature. We believe practitioners have some different, yes, thank you, some different needs than researchers. They work with audiences from early childhood to seniors, from lifetime members to first-time visitors. They want to be able to detect a change. It needs to be easy to use and easy to analyze, of course, in all the different contexts they work. So we had a workshop. We started this project by inviting people, including Chris Parsons, to a workshop that was held 2 years ago at NAAEE just before the conference in Spokane, Washington. We spent 2 days. Some of us developed the tools, some of us used the tools, some of us critically thought about the tools, and we wanted to understand practitioners so well that we could identify the best tools for them to assess connection to nature. In the meantime, we looked at the gaps in these tools where they weren't quite meeting the needs, thought about additional research that could happen, and we started to think about how we would recommend people select the tool they wanted for their program. And as we did this, we realized that a lot of these tools are thinking about wild nature, wilderness, remote, distant ecosystems. They weren't necessarily talking about the nature people experience. They also, most of them, rely on a survey to collect their data, which isn't the full range of possibilities, as we well know. We wanted to make sure that as we thought about users and environmental educators, we were selecting tools or modifying tools that reflected urban nature, managed nature, the kind of nature that people were familiar with. So the guide that we're producing, the one you can download or order through NAAEE, has 11 of these tools in it. You have permission to use these tools. You even have permission to translate the tools if you're working in another language, although we recommend that you talk to the author of the tool as well, let them know you're translating it, and do a back translation and see if it is still as reliable and valid as it used to be when it was developed in English. The guide includes information about how to select the tool, how to use it, and how to analyze the data. For example, here's what I mean by a tool. These are a few examples of the survey items in 2 of the tools, connectedness to nature. These items, I often feel a sense of oneness with the natural world, or I feel embedded in the natural world. That speaks to this relationship that people have with the environment. A different tool, how much do you like to see plants and flowers? How much do you like to take care of plants and animals? That speaks to what we do in nature and enjoying that experience of being in nature. So part of the trick we couldn't build into this booklet is you have to think about your program and what you want to measure, because all these tools are slightly different and you'll have to figure that out. We can't help you with that part, but we can help tell you what the tool is good at. So we also realized that using interviews, assessing journals and writing, drawing, photograph, observations, all of these things are also clues that we can use to think about, to explore how people are thinking about their relationship with nature. And in particular, some of these tools are really important when people don't have the vocabulary to be able to write or don't have the skill to be able to draw. For example, in very young children. So Louise is going to introduce to us a team that rose out of this workshop and focused a lot more on what does it mean to be connected to nature when you're a 3-year-old, and how can we begin to assess it? Thanks, Louise. And don't forget to unmute.
Good. Next, Gabby. Thank you, Martha. So Tom Beery and myself were in the workshop, and it really raised questions for us. As I said, what does connection to nature mean when you're looking at 3, 4, 5-year-olds? And before you can think about assessing it, you have to have an idea of what you're talking about. And we felt this had not been done yet in the nature connection literature, with a focus on what does it mean so that we can assess it. So we pulled together an advisory panel of 9 early childhood experts, and among them, actually most of them had worked on creating measures of connection to nature with children, or the related construct of empathy. They had many years collectively working in nature preschools or lab preschools with nature settings, had just done a lot of observing young children themselves, and they had worked with a great diversity of children from different countries, different cultures, ethnicities, levels of advantage in their countries. So we got them all thinking about, first of all, some basic questions like, how do you define nature connection with very young children? And we were talking about actually 2 to 5-year-olds. What pivotal experiences should we be looking for that mark its development during these early years? How do children this age express their feeling of connection to nature? Is it context dependent? Are they going to express it differently depending on the culture they're in, the place where the type of place where they live? And we felt that we had to kind of have a conversation together about these questions and kind of see what commonality there was among us. And then on that basis, evaluate the 4 early childhood nature tools that had been published and were in use. Based on that, we selected 2 tools together, had consensus on 2 tools that we recommended for the guide, and we'll get to those later. Next, Gabby. So asking that question, what does it mean when we're talking about young children? Well, I think here are some of the key things that really characterize connecting to nature at these ages of 2 to 5. And you can see them in other ages as well, but they really kind of are dominant in what people said they observed working with very young children. The tendency to see everything as alive. I mean, as adults too, we can feel a river is alive, but really common among very young children to feel it's all alive. The clouds are alive. They're waving at us. The rocks are alive. It's all alive. And connecting with nature is a full body experience with young children. I mean, it really means they want to move freely through it. They want to engage with it with all of their senses, and with great interest and curiosity as they're moving through it. And it's not exactly the same thing as empathy for other living things, but it sure is very closely connected and kind of overlapping. And so we, in terms of how young children express it, a lot of their expressions of it are empathic in terms of other living things. So we cannot sit them down with paper and pencil surveys, but if we can make the assessments playful, we have them. So people who were developing ways to work with young children, they were using puppets games, picture choices, and so interviewing children through these different means. Here's Tom Beery bought a couple puppets to start using the biophilia interview, which we'll talk about more later in his work in Sweden. And so but we knew it was working when the children would say, "Can I play it again?" And really saw these assessment processes as a game. So why is it important? I mean, well, I think this question, how do we assess connection to nature in young children? It's really come up to the front because we have nature preschools and kindergartens spreading rapidly around the world. And almost always, they say in their mission statement, their goal is to connect children to nature. So then they are faced with, okay, how do we demonstrate that we're doing it? So it is an important question for them. Okay. And also, again, just kind of understanding what is going on. These early childhood years are such a formative period of socialization, of learning to feel comfortable in nature and value it and care for it and be interested in it, have your interest confirmed and encouraged. So it's important to also use these assessments to understand kind of what is working with young children in encouraging socialization to feel connected to nature.
So now I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the guide and how we hope it can be useful to you, whether you're working with young children or adolescents or adults, because we've got tools for all of these groups. And I believe the link is in the chat for you to download the guide, but I'm just going to walk you through some of the different tools and some of the different options you have. So of the 11 tools that are featured in the guide, 8 tools are more of these paper and pencil surveys, like Martha referenced earlier. They have responses on scaled responses, you know, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree or do not like at all to like very much. And then we also have 3 tools in the guide that collect qualitative data. So that's the nature relatedness observations, which are great for working with young children and evaluating those nature experiences, journaling, and the interpretation of drawings. And so we've got a range of options for you depending on your need. We also have a decision tree that is a big feature of the guide and we hope will really be useful to you. And this has a lot of text on it. You don't need to worry about reading it all right now, but I want to walk you through some of the big questions and points, decision points in the decision tree to help you know which tool might be most useful to you. So the first question you're going to come upon in the decision tree is, do you want to use a survey? And so do you want to use one of those 8 tools that is has these scaled responses, or are you more interested in using drawings, journals, or another non-survey approach to measure connection to nature? So once you answer that question, yes or no, you're going to be guided to a question that says, what is your target age group? Because we do have different tools that have been adapted for use and are more appropriate to use with different age groups. And so if you'd said no to the first question and you want to use drawings, journals, or other non-survey approaches, you're then going to be guided here and taken directly to either nature relatedness observations for early childhood or journaling and interpretation of drawings for children, adolescents, and adults, because those are the 3 options. But if you said you do want to use a survey, you're going to be taken up to a different set of options. For early childhood, we just have the biophilia interview, which Louise will talk about a little bit more in a moment. But we also have a lot more options for children and young adolescents or adults and adolescents. So if you choose one of those 2 groups, you're going to be then asked, are you conducting a one-time assessment? And this gets back to the question that Martha kind of raised earlier is, are you interested in evaluation or planning? So are you interested in taking a one-time assessment to understand where your audience is right now? Or are you interested in a pre and post evaluation to kind of understand whether or not connection to nature changes over time after an intervention or experience or program. And so if you say, yes, I just want a one-time assessment, all of the tools in the guide are going to be useful to you because you're just doing a one-time measure. But if you say, no, I really want to assess change over time, you're going to be taken to this list of tools. And this is really the trickiest question in the decision tree for most people. You're going to be asked, what is your program's intensity? So what do we mean by intensity? Well, intensity, we're defining that as a function of time and engagement. So what is the duration or frequency of the program that you're trying to assess and assess its effect on someone's connection to nature? And how engaging do your participants find that program? So we really want to know how impactful, do we think this program is going to be on somebody's connection to nature? Because that's going to affect the type of tool that you use, because these tools, your connection to nature may not change in a measurable way with some of these tools if the program is not long enough or not engaging enough. And so if you say, for example, my program is just a short nature walk in a garden, you're going to be taken probably to the low intensity option there. And what that says is that your program may be very useful and impactful, but a short exposure, like a short nature walk or even a one-day field trip, may be unlikely to influence connection to nature in a way that can be measured with these tools. So it doesn't mean your program isn't important, but you might want to pick a different outcome like knowledge or attitudes, which are more likely to change with a short exposure. But if your program is medium intensity or high intensity, we've got a list of tools that you could select from. And what we really recommend is looking at those tools, reading through them in the guidebook, and seeing which tool you think might resonate the most with your particular audience. Because the tools do use different language to describe connection to nature. They talk about nature in different ways. And so just by reading through, you may be able to say, oh yes, this one seems right for my audience. And these are the tools for children and adolescents, but we have the same kind of options and the same question about intensity for adolescents and adults. So in this way, you can at least be pointed in the right direction for a tool that could be right for your need. So now I'm going to walk you through a couple of scenarios. So the first is just thinking about if you were part of an organization that wanted to learn how its members feel about their relationship with nature. So this is probably an example where you could do a one-time assessment. You just want to know where your members stand right now. How connected do they feel to nature? For a one-time assessment, once again, you could use any of those tools. So depending on the age group of your audience, you might use the Love and Care for Nature scale or the Environmental Identity scale if you had adults that you were trying to assess. Inclusion of nature and self is great for adolescents and adults, so that might be a good option. Now, you might have a different need. You might say you're an organization who wants to know whether participating in a 10-day backpacking trip influences connection to nature for 2,000 plus participants. So that's a really big group of people. So in that case, you would use the decision tree, and you should end up somewhere on these survey approaches, using a scale as a pre and post, because you want to know whether or not participating in the backpacking trip changes connection to nature. So you would take a pre-measure and a post-measure. And these are three options. There are other options that might work as well in the guide, but connectedness to nature scale, environmental identity scale, and the nature relatedness scale would all be good options. You'd be directed to these options rather than journaling or the interpretation of drawings, because you've got such a big sample. It would take a lot of time to code 2,000 journal responses, but you could very quickly go through and sum up all of the responses from these 11-point or 14-item scales. And then the third scenario is, how does a 10-day backpacking trip influence connection to nature among 10 participants? So here we're honing in and we're saying one backpacking trip, is there change in somebody's connection to nature over the course of this 10-day backpacking trip? And this is where you might want to use journaling or interpretation of drawings. because you really want to understand the process by which the backpacking trip or experience influence people's connection to nature. And you've got a small enough group that you can really take time to dig in and look at their responses, and maybe look at journals over the course of a 10-day trip. If you had a daily journal, you could look at how they describe their connection to nature over time. So that's a great strategy to think about when you've got these smaller groups and you really want to understand more about the process and the mechanisms by which their connection to nature has changed. Oh, you've got to unmute.
Okay. I'm going to share a couple of scenarios with working with very young children. And both of them are based on actual studies that have done. In this case, this was an application of the biophilia interview, which is you'll find in the guide, to a pre-post. And Simge Yilmaz, who I believe is in the audience here, who works with young children in Turkey, she evaluated a 4-week curriculum of nature activities, which took classes, 3 different classes of young children out every week to do structured activities, to do free play in nature, to do nature walks. So they had these series of activities over 4 weeks. And then the question was, is that enough to make a difference? And so working with 40 children, did a pre and post using the biophilia interview, and found out that indeed it did make a difference. And they looked at teacher, compared the classes to see if this was because of teacher effects, but it evidently wasn't. They saw these changes across the 3 classes. And Simke did a variation of the interview. You saw the puppets before in the Swedish study. And so it was designed originally with puppets, again, to make it playful, something young children will enjoy. And there are 11 questions which present kind of 2 choices each time. So in this case, what Simke used instead of puppets was picture choices. And so in this case, a girl, the pictures would be of a boy if it was a boy, but here it's a girl. And then the child is asked, this girl likes to catch bugs and look at them. This girl doesn't like to catch bugs and look at them. Which child is like you? And then the child would pick the picture that they associated themselves with. And so playful, something that was really an enjoyable activity. Okay. So we also include in the guide a discussion of evaluations, but and it's really goes into kind of starting out, establishing a relationship with the children, using notes, note keeping during observations, also photographs, video, and how do you write it all down and put it together? How do you analyze it? But it also recommends combining observations with other methods. So triangulating, as we say, to kind of, if you're looking through different perspectives, what do you see? So also having conversations with teachers, having informal conversations with the children themselves as they're, about what they're doing, conversations with parents, focus groups with parents. So the guide really talks about all of these together as a package with observations. And in that case, you can really look at change over time and observe the impact of a program over time. And I think really this is very helpful in planning, as Martha was talking about. So here's a couple of references to studies that have used observations and also informal conversations to do that. So if you want to dive in deeper to either of these approaches, you can go to the references and kind of see people actually, you know, taking up these approaches and what does it look like as they unfold.
And now it's my turn again. Thanks. I was watching the chat and almost forgot that this was coming. So now you have this guidebook, and it's a toolbox for you to use. It's not perfect. There's still things that could be developed. You could help advance these ideas, or researchers out there who might be on right now as well, might be interested in exploring some of these topics. We don't know that these tools are as perfect as they ought to be for the urban environment, for indoor nature, for looking out the window as opposed to sinking your hands in the dirt. And I don't know if they've had any kind of research around vicarious experiences with nature, simulations, videos, television. All that stuff is a question. We just don't know. I think that several of these tools have been used in non-English speaking places. So translations have already been developed. But how does it compare? How does it work with people who come from a different cultural orientation? There's lots of questions that we have about these tools. The whole world of qualitative research, it would be helpful if we had packages for practitioners that were easier to use. Right now, we've definitely taken a step in that direction. We could go further, or someone else can pick up the ball and go further. And then how there are individual differences with people and with the environments themselves. Oh, these are good questions. And there's a lot more work that can be done. There's resources that can help you, however. Certainly eePro on the NAAEE site has 2 subgroups that chat about these sorts of things. One is called Connection to Nature. The other is called Research and Evaluation. And putting questions in that group, or asking for people who have advice, or providing your own advice to others, is a way we can help build our community and all do better. There are collaborations that could be made between practitioners and researchers, either through NAAEE, through eePro, or through your own affiliate, or through a university or college that's in your area. So there's all sorts of people out there that could be helpful. And there's an evaluation portal that is coming someday soon. Duke University is launching this with NAAEE, which will include all of these tools, plus a whole lot more that will help environmental educators evaluate their programs. There's also the resources that we've used in our work that could be useful to you. And we've put the citations in here, but you'll get these slides. You don't have to copy them down now. You can just know that these are available to you, and a whole lot more. And in fact, there's references in the back of the guide that also say, we didn't pick these tools, but they could be more useful to you if you want to look at attitudes or knowledge, not just connection to nature. So there are a lot of resources out there. And I think I should stop now and leave time for answering your questions.
And to all the panelists, great job, wonderful job. We have one question from Jocelyn that came in about asking about, isn't love of nature innate, and that kids learn not to love nature because of the fear of adults. So if you want to respond to that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. Since I've been thinking about early childhood, closest to innate, I can take that question. Well, if we think of the idea of biophilia, that affiliation with nature, from E.O. Wilson, he actually says in the very beginning, it can be double-sided. There's biophilia and there's biophobia. And a lot of experiments show that we actually may have an innate fear of snakes and spiders and things like that, that we probably should be very careful about. But does socialization matter? I think absolutely, unquestionably. I think children will go out there and that's what observations really show this. Children will go out there with this great curiosity and they full body into it. But you know, if they're held back and they've got a caretaker, a parent who says, don't do that, or ooh, an inchworm, that's yucky, then that's what they're learning, versus being encouraged to engage with nature in responsible ways.
Thanks, Louise. That was great. Anybody else want to add to that? Good answer. Another question that came in, you had mentioned, Martha, I think that spending time in nature, and several of you might have mentioned, does lead to conservation stewardship values. Is that in the resources that you provided of that research that shows the connection between spending time in nature and nature connectedness to conservation stewardship or values later?
I would recommend that people go to an article that was recently published, 2019, by Julie Whitburn and her colleagues out of New Zealand. She did a meta-analysis of, I don't know, 20 different studies that all looked at connection to nature and environment behaviors, and was able to look together across that whole spectrum of existing literature to say, yeah, well, in some cases, there's strong correlations between connection to nature and environmental behaviors. Yeah. Now, they measured behaviors differently in these different studies. They measured connection to nature differently in these different studies. And so we're looking at a 30,000 foot view as opposed to an individual view. Yeah. So in your own programs, things are going to be more specific and you could target them more directly. But she's got the big picture, and that's a great resource to use. Gabby, did we put it on this slide?
I don't think we did, but I can look it up and just share the link in the chat real quick.
Yeah.
Great.
Oh, thanks,
So
Gabby.
I just had an article that just came out this month in the journal Planet and People and Nature, where I did a review of the literature specifically related to children and adolescents and nature connection. And it shows the same thing, just what Martha was talking about. And I do believe that Whitburn's review is referenced in there, but focusing just on children and adolescents, yes, they're, again, different measures, very different samples, but you do see a recurring relationship between time in nature, connection to nature, caring for nature.
Great.
I should
go ahead.
Sorry, we just looked at some people in a particular environment where there had been water quality problems for years and lots of news media, and a lot of people have taken actions to reduce their water pollution. The correlation between the actions and connection to nature was not significant. And so I think there can be cases where lots of people are taking environmental actions, not just the ones who have a connection to nature.
Yeah, yeah.
It doesn't mean that connection to nature doesn't help them, but that's not the only thing going on out there. And so people can take environmental behaviors, can act on environmental behaviors for many different reasons.
Yeah, very good point, Martha.
And another question came in from Sarah. So a lot of people have asked about how the nature connection tools can help with grant reporting. So Sarah asked, what assessment would work well for a 2-hour themed outdoor exploration for grade 5 and then 6 to 8? So it's a total of 4 hours for 1 week. What would you say, which assessment, what tool, any help? I know that's getting pretty specific. But any thoughts on that? And we have a lot of other questions coming in.
Yeah, I would say you're right at the edge of, you know, is it impactful enough for connection to nature to show a difference? For the scales we have in this guide to actually measure connection to nature, number one, and measure it so well that you can detect a significant difference between pre and post. I think it'll depend a little bit on the population that comes. If they already have a strong connection to nature, you might not see a change. It will also depend on, is it just the 4 hours in the program, or is there pre-work that happens before they come to your site and more work that happens afterwards? So some classrooms may spend 3 months on a topic, but only 4 hours outdoors. And
Yeah.
the whole thing may improve their connection to nature.
Yeah.
So I would practice before I would guarantee that you're going to see change to a funder.
Thanks, Martha. Drew, do you have any questions that have come in?
I saw one from Caroline Cruz. What are some great tools and resources for showing teachers and encouraging them about connecting students to nature virtually or in person now during this school year, even with at-home learners or on-campus learners?
So one thing we've been suggesting to teachers here in Florida is that they consult their 4-H program, because 4-H is, it's through their extension university across the United States. They've developed resources for kids to use on their own outdoors. Some of them are outdoors, but they're not designed for classroom teachers to use as a group. They're designed for individuals to use. And so if kids are stuck at home because of COVID, then a parent or an older brother or sister could help that young kid go do some of the activities that are in the 4-H book. Some are related to trees, some are related to wildlife, some are related to nature outdoors. And so we might have to rethink the resources that we're making available to teachers if kids aren't in school.
And if you go back to the introductory slides, there was the title of a recent book I did with a couple of colleagues called Placemaking with Children and Youth. So it's methods for place-based education and evaluating places with kids. And a lot of those are activities that can be given as assignments for kids to do around their homes. We had to take all of this online after COVID, so last spring and again this fall. And so we're finding many of those methods also can be shared then through smartphones, through Zoom. So you might find some good ideas in that book.
Sorry, I answered the wrong question, Drew. I think that the classroom teacher would just go through this book and say, which are the things that I could use with my age level? Because I don't know if they're, 8 or 12 or 15. And yeah, any of these tools can work. And they could do it in September to see what are my kids responding to? And then over the year, is my program changing their connection to nature?
I saw 2 questions in the chat that I just thought would be interesting to address. One is this question about if you're trying to evaluate a program and you're evaluating all kinds of different things, right? How does it change knowledge? How does it change attitudes? So you only have a little space to evaluate connection to nature because you don't want to take 45 minutes, of course, to do an evaluation, particularly with kids. What do you do? Do we have any recommendations for a short measure? And so the 2 that I would direct you to are the Inclusion of Nature and Self scale, which is a 1-item pictorial kind of scale that has Venn diagrams that go, Martha's doing it, from completely overlapped. That's how, you feel like self and nature is completely overlapped to completely separate. That's one. And then the nature relatedness scale has a 21-item version, but it also has a 6-item version. So it has a shorter version that has also been shown to be valid and reliable. And so that would be another way, if you wanted more than just one question, that would be a great place to start looking.
Jake asked about one of the surveys having a Likert scale of 7 with young people and 5 with adults. Anything about why and when you use 5 and 7 or 10 or 15?
It is research on that.
I knew there would be.
What I learned was that 5 tends to be sufficient. So you can use 5 and feel like it's okay. Obviously, somebody used 7. And if you use 7, it gives people more room to agree and disagree. I think that when you used a balance scale, when it's 0 in the middle and you move more negative and you move more positive, then 5 may not be big enough. Because if everybody is in favor, you only have the option of somewhat in favor or a lot in favor. If you've got 7, now there's 3 on that plus or minus side. So you see more variation. So the more variation there is, the more likely you are to see a change from pre to post. So that may be what's going on. What I actually prefer, instead of a balance scale with 0 in the middle, is a rising scale that goes from none to a lot, because now you've got 5 different points that could potentially show variation. So these scales are all different, and yeah.
We still have a lot of questions. Drew, do you want to ask one of the ones that have come in? We'll take another couple of questions and then we'll close out. We could talk to the 3 of you. So thank you all for sending questions.
Trying to see what is the latest one that we haven't gotten to yet.
While you're looking, we have one from Elizabeth that asked about what accounts for the lack of connection to nature besides role modeling of their parents, but also the consequences might be attributable to a lack of connection to nature as youth age. So it's kind of like, what is it in addition to role modeling that might account for that lack of connection to nature, and what does that mean as kids grow up?
So one thing to mention is that people have detected a dip in age along about adolescence. So connection to nature is high for very young kids, and then a little bit less right when kids get more interested in hanging out with their friends and going to the mall and whatever. But then can pick back up again in teenage and young adult years. I would just be making it up if I said anything about what accounts for the lack.
Yep.
Well, in the literature review, I deal with that dip in adolescence, and as one girl said in an interview study, she was a big leader in their eco school when she was younger, and now she's a teenager, and she says other things become important like boys and clothes. So, and again, we have to talk to the kids and find out from them, you know, what's taken over in their lives.
Okay, Drew, you get the last question.
Is there data out there that supports engaging more students and school-age kids as a better model than these same school-age kids over a period of time? Wondering also, is the magic amount of time that research says getting students enough exposure to start to care and perhaps start to be stewards?
One of my students is working on that question, and it's not in the literature yet. But certainly, the more experience, the more exposure you can have with the same kids, there's a possibility that they'll strengthen their relationship to nature and their environmental skills to a point. Once kids get bored, it's like, oh, we're doing this again, and now you've lost it. You've gone too far. So there could be too much, and don't go there. So my suggestion would be continuing to make it different each time, make it more interesting. I forget the other half of the question. Gabby, do you remember?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that it gets to it a little bit. There was a wonderful kind of brief that we can try to share as well that Nicole Ardoin's team did on dosage. And that really talks about a lot of these issues, about repeated experiences over time with the same group of students and how that can deepen connection to nature versus, you know, this idea of trying to spread out and reach as many students as possible. So that might help think through some of those questions.
That would be great if you could share that reference.
Thank you, Gabby. Thank you all so much. I just want to give you one last chance quickly. Any final thoughts for our audience before we wrap it up with just a few reminders? Martha, anything?
Oh, sorry. I thought you were talking to the audience.
No. Anything to you? Any final thoughts?
I was just going to say, this is fantastic. There's a lot of interest in this topic. There's a lot of work that has been done. You don't have to start from scratch. There's resources out there to use. And there's people that can help. Obviously, there's 100 people out there interested in all this.
Yep.
Come to the NAAEE conference because there's going to be a whole bunch more people interacting on this and other topics.
Louise, any final words?
Well, I think I don't know if any of you anticipated so much interest, all of you, Gabby, Martha, Judy, when you started on this project. We've been just kind of a bit awed by it, that we've kind of touched something that really matters to a lot of people.
Yeah, it's been great. And Gabby?
I think if any of you use these tools and learn something interesting, like feel free to reach out to us and share with us, because one of the wonderful things about using the same tools across lots of different programs and situations is that we can kind of start to understand a little bit more about some broader questions. So we'd love to hear from you.
Well, thank you all so much. We're so lucky to have you all on. And just very quickly, you will all get a copy of the PowerPoint, the chat. If you go to EE Pro and you go to the monthly webinar series, you'll see the recording there. And you'll be able to also look at all the past recordings. We record all of our webinars. I also want to mention we have an upcoming webinar on October 6th. This is going to be great. It's going to be about media literacy and civic engagement with 4 outstanding panelists. Given this time, how do we think about those skills that you need both as kids and adults to actually be media literate? And then, as Martha said, thank you for talking about the conference. It is just a few days away. We're going to have almost 400 sessions available on demand for a year. So if you sign up for the conference, you get those sessions recorded and you can listen to them at your leisure. But we have an amazing lineup of speakers and presenters, including Martha Monroe, who will be one of the keynotes on the research symposium. We have Dr. Kendi, we have Amy Nizuka Matatio, we have so many wonderful people. And I just want to remind you that the costs are pay what you can, down to $25, that we know it's a tough time. We know many people are struggling. So thank you all for joining. Have a really great rest of the day. And thanks again to our panelists. And Drew, thank you. And thanks to our captioner. Take care, everybody. Thanks.